Hi, Sandra.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Paola. Nice to meet you.
Fine. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Good.
Let's just
All
wait
right.
for everyone to join. Hi, Cynthia.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Good. I was just trying to find a suitable place. So it's so hard. Hey, Sandra, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Cynthia?
I'm fine. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I bet I
Pleasure.
picture you probably having like 1,000 invitations a day. You're so
No, not that many. And I don't accept them all.
well, we're very honored that you accepted this one. Thank you.
No, happy to, of course. Yeah, excellent.
Yeah. And you got a sense of the outlines of the talk from Paola and others of what
Yes.
we're in, the systems and rules that are advancing women's representation around the country, around the world, and then where possible, how can we learn from the example set by the other countries to figure out how to advance women's representation in the United States.
Okay. All right. I will try and land that. But yeah, we'll do.
Talk about what you know most about. That's the most important thing.
Okay. What's the sort of running order?
So I was thinking about, I'm gonna talk a little bit about the Represent Women report, how we are doing the ranking of the countries, and how the US is on the third place, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. And then we're gonna go ahead and talk a little bit about voting systems and their influence on outcomes and how that helps or doesn't help women. And then we're going to talk about gender quotas. And then Hannah, hi Hannah, she's going to share her screen and she's going to show a little bit of the international dashboard that Represent Women has. And then at the end, we can talk about how female leaders have impacted, for example, COVID or so. Hi, Tiffany. Thank you for joining. Hi.
Of course.
So we're just going to wait for 12 to start.
Tiffany and Sandra, do you know each other? Have your paths crossed?
I don't think they have.
Not yet. How are you?
Good. Nice to meet you, Tiffany.
Right. And then after we cover those things, maybe like the last 15 minutes we could use for questions. We have a couple of questions already written down for you. But if any of the attendees decide to set a question out, we could prioritize that. And then we can, after that, there's just a couple of action steps that we're going to provide and be done by 1. If that sounds good with everyone.
Yeah, it would be very dynamic, snappy substance.
I'm gonna move. I think you can see my golf club, so I'm gonna move.
That's great. Tiffany, you're allowed to play golf.
There we go. Cher has a multitude of sin. I just saw his golf clubs back there, like, there go the golf clubs.
No worries, no worries. Sandra, just for context, Tiffany is CEO of the Reflect Us Coalition that a few of us helped to start, of nonpartisan women's representation organizations.
Okay, cool. Nice to meet you.
She and you and I share an interest in actually what's going on around the world. Crazy as that might be.
Yeah, and there's a lot.
Yeah, I know.
There's a lot right now.
Like Belarus is so interesting. So much that's so interesting.
Yes. Yeah,
anyway,
absolutely.
I'm going to disappear, but thank you very much and I look forward to talking with you, Sandra, when you have time again.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. So we're about to start. I'm just waiting for it to hit actually 12 for everyone to join. But first, maybe we could all introduce ourselves for the attendees, and then we can go ahead and get started with our outline. And then if there's any topic that we want to also include, like we can make this as conversational as we want. Okay, awesome. So let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. To start, my name is Paola. I am an intern for Represent Women, an outreach intern. And I am here with an amazing group of panelists. And today we're going to talk about international women representation and how that influences countries and how that works. So if anyone wants to go ahead and get started to introduce themselves, and then we can get started with our talk.
Hi, my name is Tiffany Gartner. I am the CEO of Reflect Us, a national nonpartisan coalition of 9 of the leading women's representation organizations, and I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Sandra Pepper. I'm the Director for Gender, Women and Democracy at the National Democratic Institute. And the National Democratic Institute is a non-partisan, non-governmental, not-for-profit organization that focuses on democratic consolidation and support around the world. We do no work in the United States.
Hi, my name is Hannah So, and I'm a research intern for Represent Women this summer. This summer, I've been mostly focusing on our international projects.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started with a little bit of context of where we're at. So Represent Women, what we do is we gather a lot of research, and we create different ways in which we can explain how gender parity works around the world. So as for international research, Represent Women has an international report, and in 2019, it ranked all countries based on the level of women representation in their national legislature. And the US currently takes the 83rd place. So currently there are only 14 women heads of state. 9 of these are in places higher than the US in our report. 50% of women's countries with women heads of state are in the top 30 of women representation. Of the countries with women heads of state, 71 have some sort of gender quotas, which is something that we're going to talk about further in the talk. While in the case of those with men heads of state, only 58% have gender quotas. Also, the report found that most of the countries ranked above of the US have proportional or mixed representation voting systems, while those below the US mostly have majoritarian voting systems. I'm sure Hannah's gonna also talk a little bit about that through her research. But also, if we want to get started, we can, if anyone wants to talk about women heads of state in the government, how that influences different countries, how that could influence the way that a country just makes their laws, their decisions, and how voting systems have an influence on all of that.
So thanks, Paula. I think you hit on a number of issues, actually, in that roundup. So first of all, we don't essentialize women. Yes, the women who make it to the top have certain inherent characteristics and capabilities, but we must also look at the systems. And you actually outlined the systems very well. Where you have more women in politics, you might actually be more likely to have a woman rising through the ranks. Where you have proportional representation and other voting mechanisms, rather than first past the post or majoritarian, you're likely to have more women coming through the ranks. Other things that have been spotted by the World Bank, for example, were things around women's decision-making capabilities within their own domestic space. So to the extent that you have laws that give women autonomy over their lives with regards to opening a bank account or getting a passport or whatever, those sorts of states also tend to have better gender equality, and therefore more women in politics, and therefore a greater likelihood that a woman will emerge. So I think you're really hitting on some very important things. Yes, women have essential characteristics, some, but the systems, the environment, the sociocultural environment, the institutional environment through which they come is equally important for them. One of the things we are, I'm sure we're going to touch on later on, of course, is everybody's talking about how well women are doing with leading the COVID-19 crisis right now. And that has certainly been a standout issue. And I think, even the Harvard Business Review indicated that women's leadership skills and leadership the way they undertake leadership are perhaps more relevant to crisis management, because what are they? They will take initiative, they will act with resilience, and they will drive for results. I mean, all these things are really important. Women are also more likely to work with evidence and go with an evidence-based solution. So if any of that resonates with how some of the men that we've been watching around the world have led in the COVID crisis, then I think there's another piece of really solid work there, and really solid research that backs up women's leadership capabilities and skills and how they bring those to bear to crises, perhaps leading to better outcomes in those crisis situations.
All of that I totally concur with, and what I will add, and first and foremost, thank you for inviting me, and I'm quite excited about the report and the work of Represent Women, especially as Represent Women is one of the members of the Reflect Us Coalition. So you're always pushing the bar there when it comes to this type of research, which is so important. Just to give it a bit of a U.S. framework and contextualization around the issue, for me, what the report really highlights, and one thing that I think can never be said enough in the U.S. context, is just how the U.S. is faring in relation to its peer countries, right? So when you think about Western Europe, for instance, and when you think about gender parity in politics, the U.S. system is just so much further behind. So at a federal level, we have between, let's say, 25, maybe in the high 20s of female representation, which is nowhere near parity, right? And then as you get to sort of the state and the local level, it becomes sort of, it sort of mirrors that, if not becomes even worse, right? So I think the first thing we have to think about is this idea of U.S. exceptionalism, right? And in a lot of areas, we're nowhere near where our peer countries and really other countries around the world are. And when it comes to gender parity in politics, that is one of the areas where we're nowhere where we should be. With that being said, and I think, and Sandra, thank you for bringing up COVID and sort of what COVID has done in this political moment. What I am seeing, this being the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and the women's right to vote, what I am seeing in this political moment, which gives me a bit more sort of optimism and hope for the future, is really a record number of women running, and we can talk more about that as well, again, in the U.S. context. Record number of women across the board, obviously more left-leaning women are running than right-leaning women, Republican women, but you still see an uptick there. A lot more women of color running, which is a wonderful thing to see. Even the fact that we're having this whole sort of discussion and sort of waiting with sort of bated anticipation on who Joe Biden's VP pick will be, right? And the fact that it will be a woman, right? And even just 4 years ago, I mean, that's just not something that, the idea that is going to be a woman, right? Just that idea alone was not something even 4 years ago, right? Was sort of in the American parlance and sort of in our American sort of dialogue around these issues. So while I do see a lot of movement, particularly in this moment when it comes to women and them running for office, them getting close to winning office and them winning office, there's still much work to be done in the U.S. context, as this report really does lay out. And I'm very, very excited to talk more about sort of what are some of those ways that we can get the gender parity in this country that we do want to see.
For sure. Thank you so much for your answers. Is there anything else that you might want to add about that? Later on, we're definitely going to be able to cover a little bit more on COVID and on more women running now more than ever. But before we go ahead with that, is there anything else that someone would like to add?
I will say that with respect to just sort of, and for me, I come out of a human rights background. So I'm an international human rights lawyer. So for me, I base my analysis international. I sort of go global, then I come home. So we do have an issue brief that we put out, Reflect Us, just looking at that very issue, like how is the U.S. comparing to its peer countries and really its countries around the world when it comes to gender parity. And I'll include that in the chat. It's called Women Global Leadership Around the World. And I think for a lot of Americans who sort of are not sort of entrenched in this issue, they'll be quite surprised to hear just how poorly we're doing, and how when you look at our numbers, we're kind of like, on par with, countries like Afghanistan and Somalia in some areas, and you'll think, oh, not the US, But in fact, that's the reality in some of these instances, and that's really the change that we really have to be very intentional on breaking that.
For sure.
And I think, again, Tiffany, absolutely agreeing with all that you've said. Just a couple of things. Obviously, the issue of women's political empowerment, that bastion of feminist leadership, World Economic has said that it is the biggest gender gap of all the gender gaps, women's political empowerment of all gender gaps. So it tells you something really problematic and something that we must address. And it's, it is the big gender gap almost in the exact ratio of the number of women to men that are elected in parliaments. So the WEF says the gender gap on women's political empowerment is 70%. And that we're stuck really 20% of women in parliaments. So that means that 74% of all parliamentarians are men. So, you know, there is a correlation between some of these things that we're seeing, and it's very clear. I think the only thing I would want to underline again in terms of Tiffany, what you were saying is that we have to be careful to be measuring sort of apples with apples. And the fact that the US does not have a quota, but if you like, has still achieved 26%, maybe more praiseworthy than a country with a quota that is stuck at 10%. You know, so thinking very carefully again about not just the one mechanism, but how that sits in everything else that goes on in a country, I think is really important. And I hope to come on to talk a bit more about quotas when Paula gives us the go-ahead.
Yeah, so actually that's exactly the next topic that we wanted to cover, because gender quotas are such a big influence in internationally for women representation. So if you want to go straight ahead, Sandra, and just go ahead and talk about quotas, and we can go from there.
Okay, so I know that say positive action, affirmative action has a deep and history and experience here, but certainly around the world, quotas have had a huge take up, and the levels of representation that we have seen would not have been reached around the world without quotas. Somebody said that gender quotas provide an exogenous shock to the system that we're addressing or we're examining. But you know, my notes on this, I made a note to myself. I said, you know, quotas, they need intensive care treatment, really, because why? We are stuck. Even with quotas, we are stuck globally at about 25%, as I said, representation in formal parliaments and so forth. And the WF says we could even be going backwards on that in some places. You know, Nigeria, you know, the biggest population on the African continent has less than 5% women in its parliament. I mean, it's pretty shocking. So, you know, there are issues here, big structural issues that we have to address. And many quotas, my second point is many quotas don't even meet their own requirements. You know, I point to two that I can give you a sense of. You know, in Kenya, there's a constitutional requirement that no office should have more than 2/3 of any gender present. The parliaments refused to enact the legislation that would have required that to happen. So what are you seeing there? You're seeing actually male elite leaders colluding with each other to have more in common with each other than they do with anybody else in the country, including the women. So, you know, these are the systems in which we are trying to see change. And I always say, you know, turkeys don't vote for Christmas. So if we're expecting men to actually step back and hand over power, that's not going to happen. I can also give an example of Honduras, where they changed the law for gender equity in the elections, and they required that after the 5th place on the voter on the candidate list, so it's a representational system. So on the 5th place, it should be a zebra situation, so zipper situation. So man, woman, man, woman, man, woman. After that, so but why not from the 1st place? And there wasn't a bar against starting from the top, but only one party actually did start the zipper system from the top. And we know that the placing of women on these lists is a very important issue as to whether or not they actually get elected. And then finally, I think, you know, quotas have not really solved the dual problems of self-sustaining women's participation. So can women in the countries with quotas can they actually make it without the quota? And there's not a lot of evidence that it's easy for women to cross over into the open and competitive seats, so that, you know, we haven't overcome whatever sociocultural or other institutional barriers that prevent women getting elected in their own right. And then secondly, quotas have not necessarily translated into influence from the representation. So the top 5 parliaments for women's representation are all quota-bound parliaments. And they are Rwanda, Cuba, Bolivia, the UAE, and then Mexico, and followed by Nicaragua, actually. And of those 6, I would say that 5, we would have a question mark over their full democratic credentials. Okay, so they may have the most women in parliament, but then we're asking, what are those women doing? How did they get there? Who are they representing? What is their influence, and so forth? And those are the sorts of questions that, for me, we still have to better understand how representation translates into influence, whether you've got there by quota or not. But representation is not just for representation's sake. It's to actually effect change. It's to represent. It's to be accountable. It's to be responsive, and that is something that I think the quota system should be helping to address, but hasn't quite yet. Which is why I say, they need intensive care.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think with respect to quotas, I see this issue as a very all-encompassing issue, right? And when you talk about getting more women running for office, elected to office, in those positions of leadership once they're in office, heading those important committees, being able to get sort of that support behind their bills, their legislation. It's a total sort of package that we have to look at. I think quotas could possibly be one answer. At the same time, though, what I caution, again, I'll go back to the U.S. context, is that, were we to have quotas or not, that may possibly open the way to more women getting the opportunity to be in place, right? And we can talk about whether, the quota is a good or a bad thing. And again, I'm honestly mixed on that, right? But the thing that I see is, even before you get there, are all of the obstacles that women have to face in the U.S. to even get to that point. So something such as childcare, right? So there's a lot of legislation now, and folks trying to promote legislation that, we don't have paid childcare in this country, right? So if you have young, small children, we all know that running for office requires so much time, so much effort. And again, let's talk about sort of the work, the family work that happens, and how the brunt of that falls on women, right? Falls on the moms. We've seen that throughout COVID, right? So the fact that there is no national legislation providing child care is an issue, right? Then when you talk about actually, the pay, right? So for a lot of women, they enter politics in this country at the local level, right? So a lot of those local positions are either unpaid, right? Or there's nominal pay to that. Again, you have kids, you have other responsibilities. So I think, structurally speaking, there are a lot of impediments and barriers to women, even before you get to, okay, I know there's 5 slots for me. Well, what barriers do I have to cross to even get to those 5 slots you have slated for me, right? And I think what happens is something that we really kind of have to push ourselves in the women's representation movement to think about, is that what has happened, I see, is that those women, and very few of them, but those women that are able to sort of cross those barriers, a lot of times have some type of a resource, right? Some type of a support to be able to get there. So then not only does it become an issue of gender representation and parity, but also there's a social economic element to this as well, right? So when you think about, our poorer sisters, our sisters in grassroots leaders in like poor communities who really are fighting these issues at the ground level, like this isn't even a part of their world to be able to run for office, yet alone get elected, because of all of these societal barriers that we have in place. A lot of those women are women of color. You also have poor white women in communities of poor communities who just don't have access to elected office. So I think, there really has to be a rethinking of our election process, a rethinking of not just who's in and out regarding men and women, but regarding socioeconomic status, and a rethinking of the type of support, and I'll sort of call, the social programs and the social support that governments provide. They really make this a much more equal level playing field than it already is, because right now it's so lopsided, right? It's so lopsided. Like, if you have the resources, if you have the connections, you're that much more likely to, to be successful at running for office. And even, in fact, we're talking about running for office, but let's even talk about that first step to even consider running for office, right? who even considers it? Well, it's those who have the resources, right? So even I may be this dynamic woman in the grassroots, or maybe in my town or community, but it's not even going to enter my mind to even run for office because I just don't have all of the resources, the social networks that at this point is required to have in this country. So again, I'll say that quotas could possibly be an answer, but I think before we sort of, go there, or as we think about quotas in tandem, we need to think about what are all those barriers in the very first instance that are holding women back from running, particularly in this country. And I'm sure that rings true. I mean, I've done work in Africa, in particular in Cambodia, so I'm sure that rings true when you talk about, again, the brunt of the work falling to women and how, if I have these 5 kids I'm taking care of and I'm not getting any support, the last thing I'm trying to do is run for anybody's local council, local commission, or anything else.
I think you're absolutely right. Oh, can I keep talking? Yes. Tiffany, absolutely right. And everything that you've said absolutely rings true for women around the globe. And I think, to your point, it's about the care piece. Unfortunately, it's about money. Politics everywhere is hugely expensive, and unfortunately, the opportunity and the advantage that should have come with the digital world has been completely kind of spoiled for women and other marginalized groups because of the toxic nature of the digital platforms and the way that they have become spaces filled with hate and bile, which have particular targets as to women and marginalized groups. So money still is an issue. And I think the third one, Tiffany, that you were touching on there is confidence, because there's so much research that shows that when women run, they win in equal measures. They win as well as men do. But to get them to run in the first place, it's a truism almost. It's not a caricature. But women always think they only have 60% of the characteristics and the skills required. Every man thinks he's got 90% of what's required to do the job. So that confidence piece is it's huge, and it's significant, and it's something that we spend a lot of time on at NDI. And I really do think that if we're going to move the needle on this, we've got a campaign to change the face of politics. I really do think that if we are going to change the face of politics, we have to start way younger than we're doing. So, younger even than Paula and Hannah here. Really start way younger, because we know that young women, by the time they're sort of hitting puberty, they are entering into a period where their leadership capacity, skills, and confidence become a huge deficit. And really waiting until they are of political age, like 18, to start working with them is too late. It's absolutely too late. We have to start way earlier and make sure that young women, adolescent girls, get through those years of puberty with strong leadership skills across the board, and with the confidence and exposure to be politically active if they wish to be.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that Sandra and Tiffany have said so far about quotas. I think that it's really important to consider also just the socio-political context in which the quotas exist, because it's important to recognize that they don't just exist in a vacuum, that there's so many different other factors that can affect quota success. But just to bring in a little bit of research from RepresentWomen, we've been looking closely at the countries that rank above the US in terms of gender parity. So the US currently ranks at 83rd. And we found that out of all the countries that rank above us, 63 of them, or 77% of them, do use some sort of quota. So there is evidence to suggest that quotas could be helpful. But again, I also think that's important to look at enforcement mechanisms, context, and based on our research, some enforcement mechanisms that I think could be potentially helpful are legal sanctions and financial sanctions. So some countries, I think Poland and Spain, for example, use legal sanctions where if a country or if a party list doesn't include enough women or doesn't meet the law, the Committee on Elections or some sort of electoral authority can reject the party list and in effect make it impossible for that party to run in that election unless they change their composition. In addition to that, there's some countries where parties that don't meet the quota can be fined or lose funding from the state, which I think is another incentive for sure. And then in addition to that, I think that it's also important to just look at parties themselves, because parties are definitely not monolithic. Each party has its own ideology, culture, emphasis on gender parity. And so I think that it's also important to consider the role that parties play as gatekeepers and even allowing women to run in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much to the three of you for adding on to that. For all attendees, feel free to also write in the chat or in the Q&A box some questions that you might have. But just to close up on gender quotas, I was just wondering if any of you would like to pinpoint a couple of maybe like more specific pros and cons about gender quotas. Just a quick way for us to close that up and segue into maybe Hannah showing us a little bit about the international dashboard and how that works. But as of right now, any pros and cons that we can find with gender quotas, I can totally see how it is something very big. It is much more, and like Sandra said, much younger. So what are some things as of right now that, for example, these top 5 countries who have gender quotas, what are some pros and cons of using that?
Well,
Okay.
should I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead, go.
No, so I think, as I said, for me, the pro is still a very strong one, that you get more women in. But and this is, I argue with my deputy every day on this. For me, the cons almost outweigh it, because the cons are that you're not dealing with representation. Not dealing with influence. That the places where quotas can be forced through almost against the desire of the population are places where the democratic context itself is not necessarily the healthiest for women either. And I think the other big con for me is that we haven't yet at least been able to prove that the quota will lead to a self-sustaining engagement for women's ability to become politically active, to win seats, and to be in power. So those for me, that's the constant balance I have in my head about quotas. And Hannah, your point about the fact that they are complicated. Some of them are voluntary at party level, some of them are constitutional and mandatory, some of them hit representation, some of them hit candidates. It's a very complicated field, and frankly, even the decision about which quota and how it is a political decision. It is part of a political set of compacts and contracts and payoffs in some way between political leaders, because what we've seen is that male political leaders go for quotas for a variety of reasons, mostly not usually about women's empowerment, but about women as numbers or women as supporters, or to shore up their position in some way or other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I totally agree with Sandra too. I'm very hesitant to back a system of quotas, or to sort of say that's sort of where we should be putting our energy and our efforts. I think if anything, one of my biggest concerns about quotas is that you're really kind of addressing a symptom, but not the actual root causes of the problem. And I think, again, bringing it back to a U.S. context, it's very evident where, if you think about affirmative action, right, and who it was, originally meant to or the harm that it was originally meant to redress, and how that hasn't happened, right? And these recent social uprisings that we've seen after George Floyd is part and parcel to that if you have a system like affirmative action, like quotas, but yet there's whole sort of swaths of communities that were meant to be, benefited from that haven't, right? So you have whole, masses of communities that were shut out, right? So in a quota system, it can become very tricky about who is the ultimate benefactor of it, right? So we can go into a quota system, maybe ideally thinking, well, we're going to benefit this particular community or this particular characteristic. And at the end of the day, you'll find that maybe the majority of those who benefit look nothing like, you know, the initially harmed community, right? And again, I go back to George Floyd and those, you know, current, you know, social risings that are happening in the US, right? Also, as I said before, with the quota system, you're really looking at sort of a, you know, one part, right, of sort of a multi-tentacle kind of problem there. And so maybe you get that right. From what I've seen, usually you get it wrong, but maybe you can get it right. But again, you know, back to Sandra's point about, you know, starting with women when they're younger, you know what I mean, changing policies so that more women run, making sure that this isn't an elitist game. A lot of the women who have been able to enter politics, by and large in this country and around the world, I'll say it again, still come from some measure of resource. Now, again, the numbers are still very low. We still need to fight that regardless, right? That's not the point. But the point is that if you look at the women who have been able to access political power, there's still some level of resource there, some level of social capital there. So again, there's still whole swaths of women that are left out of this process. And so for me, I think and then the other danger is that once you put quotas in, then there's this false sense that we got it right. There's nothing else to do. There's nothing else to complain about. You got your quota. What's the problem? There's five of you over there, and maybe you're all sitting at the same table, and maybe you have no real power in parliament, and maybe no one's really listening to you. But guess what? You got the 5 female faces. What more do you want? You know what I mean? So I think that really we have to kind of wrestle with this issue a little bit, right? And struggle with it a little bit, both here domestically, but also internationally and abroad, about what does real sort of social change, right? What does it really look like? You know what I mean? What are all of those parts to it? You know what I mean? What would it look like? And that's kind of a hard kind of wrestling to do, right? But I do think that if sort of this idea that one size fits all and one solution fits all, that I think we have to be very cautious about.
So I have a question for our panelists. Would you rather answer some questions from the public right now about gender quotas, or would you prefer to wait till the end? No? Okay, awesome. So Maura Riley asks, would implementing quotas at local levels of political office help open up the pipeline for higher office and solve some of the issues of influence versus representation, which national quotas have not necessarily solved?
You know, I'll just jump in quickly, and Sandra, please expound on my comments. My thing would be that any quota system that one would think about implementing, be it at the local, state, federal level, for me, again, I'm one that's sort of not, you know, a big proponent of the idea, generally speaking. If it were something that were to take place, I would say to make sure that it has a very strong social movement component to it, so that when you do open up, let's say, a quota system at the local level, there needs to be really strong actors on the ground in that local community that are working with a very diverse population of women, right? So that when you talk about a pipeline, the pipeline doesn't come from the same stream. You know what I mean? So if we're gonna talk about a pipeline, we need to make sure the pipeline is drawn from different streams, right? And a lot of times, I'll say it again, with quotas, with sort of these sort of narrowly tailored sort of fixes, it goes from the same stream. So if that is something that were to be proposed, I would say that we need to make sure that there's a very strong social movement on the ground, strong, you know, social leaders on the ground, strong community organizations on the ground that are diverse, that are like multiracial, multi-economic, multi-ethnic, that really does reflect that community and the women in that community, and that they're plugged into that pipeline. And then and only then would I feel comfortable saying, you know, a quota is the right way to go forward.
So I think, again, I'm going to agree with a lot of what Tiffany's saying. I like that idea about, you know, new pipelines and coming from the same street and stuff. The best researched example of this that I know about around the world comes from India, where the panchayat, which are the lowest local, I mean, it's almost village council level, have for many years, many decades now, had a 30% quota for women. And because it's been studied longitudinally, we can say some definitive things. We can say that the essence of these young women have changed the content of what is decided at local level. They've changed the focus and target some of those decisions. They've changed the way decisions are made at that level. And importantly, they've changed both fathers and mothers' expectations of their daughters in leadership. So I do believe that, that there is something about opening up that local level, because it is across the world, even in the United States, it's usually the first level that women go into politics at. They go into their local politics or their school board politics or whatever it is. That's where most women actually start. My two caveats on this are, I'm not saying that every woman has to do that before she can run for president. So let's be careful about that, because that becomes the next, to Tiffany's point, the next narrative is, no. She hasn't been a local councillor, therefore she can't run for president, you know? I'm not going to say that about the men, but it could become something we fall into, a habit thinking that women have to start there. And then secondly, again, to Tiffany's point, it doesn't really, without some intervening mechanisms, there isn't necessarily a clear path from the local level to the national, or to the state and the national and higher levels. So again, making a plea for appropriate measures and mechanisms that really take what they've learned at that level and feed it into and upwards into higher levels if they wish to go there.
No, that's absolutely right. And I will say, just sort of in closing, I guess, in this this particular discussion around quotas, is that I don't think what I'm saying, and Sandra, I don't want to speak for you, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think what we're saying is that, you know, quotas are off the table and that they shouldn't be considered. No. I think what we are saying, though, is as women, in particular as women in this field, right, as we are the ones sort of, let's say, at the ground level, really thinking about how do we get it right, you know what I mean? Yes. Then I think we really have to kind of like push ourselves with any proposal, right, quotas or otherwise, that we think about, and we're the ones, right, because it kind of starts with us, right? So as we're beginning to sort of like promulgate or beginning to sort of like propose different proposals, how should it look, proselytize different things, we have to be the ones to do that hard work to say, wait a minute though, how is this going to look in practice, you know what I mean? And we have to do this kind of wrestling together in the collective, in the family, figuring out, you know, how's it going to impact all women, not just me and my friends, not just you and your friends, right? Maybe not even those women I forgot even, oh my God, I forgot they existed. That happens, right? When you're not connected to communities, you forget, oh, I forgot they existed over there in East Jablit, you know what I mean? But I think we have to really be very, very self-critical and very self-analytical in this. And I think that's kind of the cautionary tale we're saying about quotas. It's not that they're off the table completely, never, ever, 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 but more so let's be very, very critical about how we're looking at all of these things and how they're impacting all women. And I will give this little footnote, is that as we are celebrating the 100th centennial, there's been quite a lot of, you know, commentary on who benefited from the 19th Amendment and who didn't, right? Who was shut out of that and who wasn't, right? And the fact that, you know, Black women in particular, women of color, were not a part of the 19th Amendment, right? And there's been some wonderful commentary about that. So it's kind of like a re-examining of that history, right? And all the wonders of us having the 19th Amendment and all the celebrations. My goodness, it should be celebrated, celebrated, celebrated. But in this moment, we also have to recognize who was shut out of that process, right? And therefore make sure that any proposals today that we bring forth, we don't replicate those same wrongs. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for your answers. So just due to time, I'm going to go ahead and keep going. But definitely I can see how gender quotas are something that affects not only internationally or nationally, but like locally too. It's such an interesting topic, and there's so much more to see and learn about that for sure. Okay, so the next thing that we wanted to sort of cover in today's talk was to show to everyone a little bit about Represent Women's international research that we've done. So Hannah, if you want to go ahead, and I don't know if you want to share your screen or something, to show the dashboard that the research team has been working on, and how all of this research can help for furthering like knowledge about international women representation.
Yeah, of course. I'm gonna share my screen. Oh, is this host disabled screen sharing? Sure, if you wanna setting.
Do you want to just start talking about it for a second, and I'll go ahead and figure it out while you do it.
So our international dashboard gives people kind of a look at where each country stands in terms of women's representation. So we have one dashboard that shows the entire world, but then we also organize it by continent too, if you want to do a deeper dive into each continent. And I think now I can share it. So for example, this is our world map. I'm just going to click on it so I can zoom in on it more a little bit. You can see that we have 5 different tabs. So our first tab is parliaments and ranking. And for each country, we've put where it ranks in terms of gender parity around the world, and then also the percentage and number of women in both the lower and upper house if it's a bicameral legislature. We also have different voting systems. So you can see, for example, that the United States uses a winner-take-all system for both the lower house and the upper house. And then more specifically, we use a first-past-the-post system where the candidate with the most votes wins the seat, even if they might not win a majority of the vote. And then we have a tab for gender quota. So what we've discussed, you can see that most countries actually do use some sort of gender quota. The United States does not, but you can see that especially in Europe, I think party quotas are quite popular. You can see the data for that. And then we have heads of state and government. And so again, you can see who the head of state and government is for each country. And then we also have historical data if there has been a woman head of state or government at any point. And then finally, we have a tab for cabinets. So you scroll, it shows the number of women in each cabinet around the world and their percentage. And then the bubbles here kind of give a key for what each color means. So for parliaments and cabinet, darker color, the higher the number of women. And then here we have some additional description for what each category means. And then if you go back, and this is all on our international research page on our website. Again, we have it organized by continent, so you can also do a deeper dive into each continent if you're interested. And for that, we also have more specific information based on the region as well. So I think that the international dashboard can be a really useful tool for seeing where the world stands right now in terms of women's representation, see whether there's any regional trends that might exist. And we're also currently updating all the data in preparation for our international reports this summer.
That's fabulous. That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you. Okay, so with that, we're going to go ahead and talk about 2 topics that we briefly mentioned, but I would love to hear a little bit more from what you have to say about how female leaders have influenced, as of right now for COVID, how women representation is still a thing during COVID times, and how women have shown that they can be leaders as the rest of the world. And at the same time, talk a little bit about how, as of right now, we've seen the most women run, and how that influences our governments locally, nationally, and internationally. If anyone wants to get started.
So that, there's a lot of focus on some of the standout women leaders who've had a good COVID, so to speak. So Ardern in New Zealand, and the woman in Denmark, I can't even remember all their names, have stood out. Even Angela Merkel, actually. So there's been a lot of commentary about this. And as I said earlier on, whilst I think they do all have great individual capacities, they all do sit in systems, and those systems are probably as important as anything else. One of the things, just before actually started this, there was a paper was circulated from Tom Carruthers at the Carnegie, and it was about whether or not autocrats were having good or bad COVID moments, because obviously things like states of emergency and the tyranny of the urgent, as they say, allow those with autocratic tendencies to draw in more power to themselves in the name of actually managing the emergency. But at the same time, we know that those tendencies don't necessarily lead to good governance. And so, there's a whole lot of disinformation that goes on with those sorts of tendencies. There's poor use of science, poor use of data, bad communications. I mean, we've seen this. I'm from the UK. I mean, don't even get me started on what's going on in the UK. So we've seen this everywhere. And one of my colleagues said the other day that actually, in the terms of COVID, good governance has been the biggest influence against disinformation. Because if you can actually evidence and so tends to be kind of reduced and negated, or the impact of it can be reduced or negated. So I think there have been some great great examples. Of course, it's still the case that when you have this kind of a political shock, the political space, which COVID is, it's a political and economic and a health, and decision-making kind of becomes tight to a smaller and smaller group that throws all sorts of people out, not just women, but are probably the first casualty. And what we need to think about very carefully is how do we make sure
I think Sandra froze for a little.
is big.
Oh, there she is. Sorry, Sandra, go ahead. You just froze for a little bit, but keep going.
Oh, sorry. The rights agenda is being rolled back, and we need to make sure that women are at the forefront and able to participate in the response and the recovery to COVID, so we can, reclaim and start the advance back to where we were and beyond where we were. Otherwise, really, there's no way we're going to make our global goals by 2030. This is a very, very important moment, and we all, to Tiffany's point, we all need to get in the trenches and make sure that we are promoting women's voice going forward.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree with all of that. With respect to COVID, I think, in particular, looking at the U.S. context, I think that, I think this moment really highlighted effective leadership, good leadership, and ineffective leadership. And I think that we saw that play out across states in this country. We saw that play out also in local areas in this country. If you think about, mayors like Keisha Lance Bottoms in Atlanta and Mayor London in San Francisco, and sort of some of the actions that they took, I think it really demonstrated strong leadership of women or mayors who happen to be women. I also think, and one thing that we saw at Reflect Us, because we did sort of this big body of research looking at COVID and sort of how COVID is impacting politics. And one thing that we saw, which was really interesting and encouraging, is that with COVID, there was a big highlight on two things, right? That was sort of outside of politics, but I think really helped to influence politics. One was just the awesome amount of work that women were doing pre-COVID, right? But then how that sort of responsibility of the home, of the child care really fell even more on them during COVID, right? So just sort of the important role of women and women's work, right? So that was in one bucket. Then the other bucket was looking at our first responders, right? And sort of how they became heroes in this moment, looking at our doctors, our nurses in particular, and kind of how there was sort of a gendered lens to that as well. A lot of our nurses were women, a lot of our first responders in that way were women. So kind of elevating that particular leadership. And then I think, of course, George Floyd, right, and the social uprising. I'll go back to that, right? And I think those three things together, and a lot of other stuff as well, and sort of how all those three things kind of related and interrelated with each other, I think, produced this moment where I think there's a lot of optimism now around women running for office in this country. A lot more women said, hey, look, I mean, I can do it much better than he did. You know what I mean? So a lot more women are now running for office. And there's a lot more support around this idea of a woman as a leader. Again, I think back to that female first responder, and in other ways that Keisha Lance Bottoms, seeing women as leaders. So a lot more support around this. So I think that in some ways, I think in the beginning of COVID, a lot of us in the women's representation movement, we were a little bit nervous, right? We weren't sure how this was going to shake out. A lot of the women who had plans to run for office, some of them had to fall out of the race, right? Because now, my kids are home, I got to take care of them. Or they had to fall out of the race because, I don't have the campaign contributions. In fact, there's one woman, God bless her, who was running for office down in Texas, and she took all of her campaign contributions and donated it to her local COVID efforts, okay? So there was a little bit of nervousness in the beginning of the pandemic. We weren't sure how this was going to play out. And I think now, sort of as time has rolled along and other things have kind of sort of intercepted and kind of engaged with COVID, I think you see this uptick of women running and this enthusiasm for female leadership and this acknowledgement of the importance of female leadership and kind of those unique qualities that we bring. I think to Sandra's point, as we look beyond COVID, because there will be a beyond COVID, that we in the movement and we leaders in the movement have to be very intentional and very, and again, wrestle with sort of what is the world that we want to see post-COVID, because we don't want to see the same things post-COVID or not all of the same things post-COVID, but just also being mindful of sort of what we put forth as possible solutions to getting it a bit better than what it is now. And I see some of that thinking happening, some of that deep thinking is happening. And I think this is a great moment for that, a great inflection moment, both for this country, but also for the world.
And Tiffany, again, so much there that I absolutely appreciate. And I think, to your point, one of the key things that we've learned from previous pandemics, for example, the Ebola crisis, and I used the statistic in one of my recent blogs that there were 15 million articles, scientific articles written about Ebola, and less than 1% of them looked at Ebola from a female perspective. And Ebola killed and kills women first and fastest. It is the most deadly disease because not only does it impact women's bodies, particularly if you're pregnant, if you're old, but to Tiffany's point, women were on the front line as carers, as burial attendants, the whole thing. So you have 15 million articles written, less than 1% of them about gender and Ebola. So the ability of the world to make women invisible is legendary. It's huge, and we do have to absolutely work against that specifically. So I think that is important. And I think to your point about making sure that we're ready to challenge the people want to press reset, and I keep saying we don't want to press reset. We want whole new hardware. We're just going to have a whole new thing, because if you press reset, it's status quo ante, and it was already too slow, too discriminating, too illiberal. So we're not pressing reset. We want a change, and it has to be a complete transformation, and we have the opportunity, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both so much. Your intaking these things is so interesting. Like I'm pretty sure, like for young people like me, for example, I'll talk for myself. Like as a student, I study gender studies, and like to listen to how gender plays a role in every single aspect is incredible for me. And with that, I guess one question that came up is, how can individuals such as myself, for example, and organizations or groups make a difference in terms of supporting women internationally? I don't know if you guys would give us any advice, anything that could help us.
Well, I think actually, particularly the next generation, you are so much better connected than we ever were. And I think, when I was growing up, there were perhaps bigger institutions of solidarity. The trade union movement was much more solid. The women's rights movement was institutionally, I think, perhaps stronger than it is today. But you all are connected in much more direct and personal ways in terms of not just the internet, but the issues that are important to you. And I think that's the most important thing, is to always look for the bonds of solidarity and really reach out with bonds of solidarity to other women, whether at home or overseas. I don't think it's always a one-way street. I think there are things and activism that is going on in the global South that absolutely, to Tiffany's point, could seriously influence and impact what's happening here in the United States and vice versa. I think the most important thing is to strengthen those bonds of what we call bonds of associational trust, because that makes our movement, global women's movement, more resilient. It makes it more democratic and more powerful. So that's I don't have anything very special to say, I'm afraid, on that point.
You know, I love that. I love that. I think the only thing I'll add is that, I grew up in the US, and I was one of those sort of, college kids who would spend every summer abroad, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, and then in Asia, and then had a career as an international human rights lawyer, kind of living all over the world. And the only thing I would say is that, wherever you go and whoever you call yourself, having a heart to help, which is wonderful, to always be mindful of your privilege in that space, and making sure that as you're in that space as a, in solidarity to help, that you really take your cues from those who are on the ground and those who have the lived experience and those who are directly impacted. There's this awesome quote by this Aboriginal activist who says, if you're coming to help me, you're wasting your time. And I'm going to paraphrase, but if you're coming to see how we can build together, then sort of let's go forward. And I think especially coming, as a U.S. person, right? And whatever privilege you hold and however you carry that privilege, making sure that you're aware of it. And even in your work domestically as well, right? There's differences in this country. My goodness, the past couple of months have shown us that very starkly, right? So even in this country, when you're doing the work, right, just make sure the privilege that you're carrying and kind of, sit back, you know what I mean? It's okay to sit back and kind of figure out what's going on locally, kind of, right? And what the issues are locally and what they're trying to address locally, and local knowledge and local ways of thinking that they want to, address the issue. And then so come from it from a place of humility, I think. And I think if you have that kind of spirit to it, by and large, I don't think you can go wrong.
For sure. Thank you so much. So that pretty much sums up kind of what we wanted to cover. Of course, this is a conversation that I recognize is something that needs to be talked about every day as much as we can, to actually be able to make this difference that we really want to. And I really want to thank the panel today for your time and for your super interesting intakes and everything. Thank you for being part of our last call from this summer speaker series. Thank you for being so helpful. And before we go, we just have a couple of action steps that we want to share with everyone. Of course, if the panelists want to add on to this list, feel free to message me, and then we are going to share all of this on Thursday morning to everyone that was registered, a summary of all the information that we have. So yeah, some action steps from Represent Women about international women representation. First of all would be to follow the numbers, to look for data updates on the Represent Women and Interparliamentary Union websites, as well as many other different organizations and groups. Just follow the numbers and track where women are at. And always, I remember this from a college professor, he always reminded us to think, where are the women and how do they play a role in everything? With that, also to share the data, so reshare Represent Women's posts on international women's representation. And lastly, to contact your member of Congress. Ask for your member of Congress to support the Ranked Choice Voting Act and the Fair Representation Act, both of which could help elect more women to Congress, and for us to rank a little bit higher in future Represent Women reports. So yeah, just to wrap up, again, I want to thank you guys so much, Tiffany, Sandra, and Hannah, for being here, for sharing your insights. Also, thank you to all the panelists from past talks in the speaker series. This has been a really good summer for the outreach interns being able to create this network, to learn from people as amazing as you guys and your work. It's really amazing. So thank you so much for that. And yeah, I hope you have a great day and stay safe.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. Absolutely. Pleasure to meet you, Tiffany. Thank you, Paula and Hannah. And thank you, Represent Women, for all you do. And Reflect Us too.
Thank you as well.
All right. Stay well.
Bye. Thank you
Bye.
so much.
Bye.